Originally, I was going to sit here and say that I would be talking about traditional Chinese medicine and cancer. And to an extent, I still will be, but with a slightly different emphasis. Now, TCM, or Chinese medicine, is an incredibly complicated subject. And the challenge that we have today is for me to simplify it and demystify it and make it accessible, because that is the challenge. I can speak about yin and yang, I can speak about heaven and earth, I can speak about the five elements, but it needs to be brought down and made very accessible. And that is a real challenge I have found, whether I'm speaking to other acupuncturists or even to WI. And in addition to that, cancer is also an incredibly complex subject. So as much as I can, I want to see which areas overlap and how they overlap. Now, to begin with, if I'm going to be talking about Chinese medicine, the first thing I need to say is that it is an organ-based subject. In other words, the perspective of Chinese medicine, really, they look at the body and the person based on what is happening with the physical organs. It's true of the herbal side, it's true of the acupuncture side, it's just the view that Chinese medicine has. And in many ways, it is different than how the West would view the body and the organs, because the Chinese much more view the organs with their functional state. So, for example, when I say functional state, it would be something which would be preclinical. It would be something before there might be physical changes with an X-ray. And this is something which the Chinese, over many, many centuries, have systematized and categorized according to the type of symptoms involved and the pulse, etc., etc. And the other way the Chinese medicine is very, very different is they look at each organ, but they look at it in a wider perspective. The best way I can explain it is in terms of spheres of influence. So, for example, if we're looking at the heart or the lung or the liver or the kidney, it's not just the finite physical organ, it's the whole functional state and then some. For example, if we're looking at the kidney, in Chinese medicine, they would consider the adrenal glands to be not just literally an extension of the kidney, but actually to physically be on top of the kidney. They would look at the fluid metabolism in the body. And so because the kidney is involved with the distilling and the refining of different fluids, many, many different types of fluid imbalances really are under the domain of the kidney. For example, if someone has a problem with the cerebral spinal fluid, it might be due to a kidney weakness, which is not regulating the metabolism properly. And even the whole lumbar area, the lower back, in Chinese medicine is considered the domain of the kidney, the palace of the kidney. And so when the Chinese talk about organs, they have a wider overall view than just the simple aspect of speaking about the kidney or liver as they normally do in Chinese medicine, as in Western medicine. Now, there's actually a bit of a precedent for this view in terms of the history of Western medicine, and that goes back to the ancient Greek view of what's happening in the body. The ancient Greeks spoke about the four humors. They spoke about the choleric and the phlegmatic and the sanguine, etc., etc. And the emphasis when the Greeks spoke about that was that these humors in the body actually affect the temperament, which is a very interesting comment. Now, the difference between Chinese medicine and this approach from the Greeks is the Greeks did not actually associate each of the humours with a specific physical organ, but the Chinese did. So once you realize that that is the missing link, then it puts a completely different emphasis, and it widens the whole area in a very interesting way. For example, if we're talking about someone who is choleric, then that type of temperament, he may be impatient. And so the implication of the four humours is that the temperament of someone actually comes through the body's humours, which, as the Chinese fill in the missing link, is they're saying that the temperament actually comes from the organ. And this is a very interesting concept. It is very much misunderstood and underestimated, and it is the opposite of the word psychosomatic. Now, psychosomatic means if someone has a physical illness due to emotional problems. For example, someone may have a stomach ulcer, which originally is due to having family arguments while they're eating. Or someone may have continual headaches from stress. What I'm defining, which is very central to Chinese medicine, is the concept of somatopsychic. And that means where someone will have both a certain type of temperament, which is general, like the climate, and they will have an emotional world in specific ups and downs, like the weather, due to organ function, organ weakness. Now, this has great, profound implications. For example, the most dramatic and most striking way I can explain this is in terms of a woman who has just given birth and lost a lot of blood. And because she's lost a lot of blood, afterwards she will have postpartum depression. Now, it would be a doctor of great insensitivity who would say to this patient, well, of course you're depressed. You have 18 months of nappies in front of you. What do you expect? But because of the blood loss, there's less blood in the body, less blood feeding the heart, and the heart then emotionally becomes depressed because of the physical lack of blood. This concept is actually very central to Chinese medicine, and it's very important, and it has profound implications which are simply not part of our normal everyday perception or our vocabulary. This actually was better understood in the past. Shakespearean times, this was understood, and it is encapsulated in one word, and that word is liverish. The word liverish implies someone who is irritable and on edge because of the liver. The liver is like, it's over-revving. You know, cars 20, 30 years ago used to have the choke and used to pull the choke out to inject more petrol into the engine and have it over-rev. And the liver function, one of its pathological ways, it can be over-revving in the body, giving a person that temperament. And this area is a very interesting aspect of Chinese medicine. Another aspect of Chinese medicine is that it views disease, it views life and everything in terms of a process. Western medicine, by contrast, likes to take a photograph. They like to have an image that they can specifically look at, whereas in Chinese medicine, the process is more like a link in a chain. So, for example, if Western medicine takes an X-ray or an MRI scan and they see how the cancer is at any one time, it is in a process, and the nature of the process is very important, and we'll speak about that more and more. Something else which really complicates all of the issues, and it's a feature of Chinese medicine, but it's really you can't even begin to talk about this much in terms of Western medicine. I can only describe it as the combination of factors. Now, life is a 3, if not 4-dimensional experience. If you try and make life a 1-dimensional experience and measuring it on a line, you simply cannot do it. You know, we live through space, we live through time, we live through our body, we live through emotion. And so much of a disease process is a combination of factors. And this fact alone is something which is very, very difficult to measure and to quantify, and especially difficult to package into a clinical trial. If there are 2 or 3 different factors, you cannot squeeze that into a clinical trial to measure, to present to the scientific community as something which is valid. But life is not always something which can be measured and straightforward. And so, if you take this logic one step further, it goes back to the debate which has been around at least 100, 150 years of genetics versus environment, nature versus nurture. And the definitive answer in terms of the balance between the genes and environment is it depends on the individual case. That's as definitive as we can be. But each individual case, by someone who understands the balance, can be assessed with many, many different factors involved. Now, one statement which I have heard about, which is relative to cancer, is cancer is a relatively modern disease. Now, that's a very interesting statement, and it has a lot of implications. The first thing I can say about that statement in reaction is, well, 150 or 200 years ago, we didn't really have access to X-rays, we didn't really have access to biopsies, so we had no real way of assessing or measuring what the prevalence of cancer may or may not have been. But really, to look at it in a completely different light is 150 or 200 years ago, there was a completely different level of life expectancy. So, for example, today, someone who is born can be expecting to live to be 75 or 80 years old. But if they were born 200 years ago, perhaps the life expectancy was 35 or 40. And it will give us very unique and interesting insight to look at the different reasons of why it was a much shorter life expectancy, because that will give us some extra insight into Chinese medicine. First of all, one thing which severely cut into life expectancy was the nature of serious epidemics like smallpox and typhus and typhoid. Now, like previous speakers, I think that science and the progress and what they have offered in terms of the comfort of our lives has been wonderful, and the eradication of a lot of these major diseases has been one of the great bonuses of 19th and 20th century scientific progress. But another aspect of why life was shorter is under the category of food. It's so difficult for us to imagine living today as we do in the 21st century. But 200 years ago, the average person, I'm not talking about the aristocracy or royalty, the average person would not have had access to a wide variety of food. I'm not talking about the quantity. I'm assuming some people would, of course, be hungry much of the time, but the variety of food is something which historically has not been that possible for that many people. Perhaps 90% of people would have 90% of their food from within a 10-mile radius growing from where they lived. And you and I do not have this experience, but I, for one, will sometimes crave something in a particular way. Physically, I will crave something. This is what I need right now. And this is not something that someone 200 years ago would have had access to. And so the children's nursery rhyme, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, was very much a reality. People had a much more limited diet, and that had great implications for their long-term health and longevity. Another huge factor of what existed 200 years ago, which is very different from what we have now, is the fact, I reckon most people, most of the time, 200 years ago, were simply cold and had great trouble warming up. We did not have central heating. If they had access to a hot bath, it would be much more complicated because they did not have the plumbing that we have now. To have a fire continuously going is very labor intensive. And so a lot of people who felt cold would have very little way of warming up. And imagine how that would affect the body. If you prefer not to imagine, I will tell you. It meant, for example, that it was much easier to contract pneumonia if you're feeling the cold all the time. And to reference back to Barbara Wen's lecture from 2 hours ago, once you had pneumonia once or twice or 3 times, it was then easier to contract TB. And TB then also was a major killer. And another aspect, which is greatly underestimated, today we have a 40-hour work week, and many people work indoors, and they have 2-week or 4-week annual holidays. This is luxury. 200 years ago, people worked 60, 80 hours, the majority of them outdoors, and they worked very hard. And they had no way of resting. When I first went to China in 1981, and we saw patients come in a clinic with a frozen shoulder, the treatments we saw were given every day because we understood that in China, and it probably was not that much different in England 200 years ago, if someone did not work, they did not eat. It was that simple and that direct and that brutal. And this is something, genuine struggles for survival that existed in life really took its toll. And so there's one other aspect which is really interesting if we're talking about work, and that is the subject of child labor. Now, today we have very clear child labor laws, but 200 years ago we did not. And some children, especially from poor backgrounds, needed to work, and they needed to work physically. Even now, sometimes you will find an adult who grew up on a farm, they were poor, and they needed to carry the 10-kilogram bags of potatoes when they were 8 years old, or their father had a greengrocer and they used to help out by physically carrying in. And it's not a matter of cruelty. It's not a matter that the child should be in school. It is very much simpler than that. The energy that a child is used in physical labor, and this includes heavy sport and heavy exercise at too young an age, they are taking away from their physical growth. So people who you see who were born in 1900 or 1850, much more of them were physically petite. They were physically weaker to look at because they did not have the proper energy access when they were growing up because they were having to physically work. And this is part of the whole scope of the understanding of Chinese medicine, and it puts things in perspective. And so the implication of where this fits in with cancer is, okay, now we have better food, we have softer working conditions, we have central heating, but the human body is simply not designed to live 100 years. And so something has to intervene, something has to give way on a different level. And in one type of way, cancer comes in. And when I do speak about the different categories of causing the onset of cancer, again, I will try and put that into perspective. Something else which is very interesting, if you're talking about cancer, is, again, this was referred to earlier in both lectures, what I can only describe in Chinese medicine as the constitutional tendency. Now, if this cup has a crack in it, I know that if I drop it on the floor, it is most likely to break along that crack. In California, underneath the ground, we have the St. Andreas Fault, and that is an earthquake region where the earth has a certain fault line. In the body, we also have constitutional tendencies. And these can be for many, many different reasons. The most common and obvious reason is you may have a weak heart because your father before you had a weak heart. Another aspect of a constitutional tendency is if your mother was a school teacher and she worked until 5 weeks before delivery, the energy that she could and should have been using to recycle for the growth of the baby, she was spending standing up, which a fetus doesn't like, and spending energy, and this also will affect the constitution of a baby. And I have a theory, and this is something which is one of my own perceptions, and this is completely underestimated and completely overlooked. The moment of conception I consider to be very important, but you try and put that into a clinical trial and see how many eyebrows are raised. For example, if one or both of the mother or father are drunk at the moment of conception, if the man has just finished working a 24-hour shift at the moment of conception, if a couple are on holiday and they are lying on the beach for a week when they conceive, the quality at the moment of conception is something which is a whole field of study in itself, but this will not be something to easily to quantify and easy to measure. And so if something like a heart condition can be passed on via the family, I believe that a tendency towards cancer, because of how the organs may be, you may have the tendency. Now, let me qualify that. What I mean is, if your mom had breast cancer before you, it doesn't mean that you must have breast cancer. It just means that statistically, you're more likely. Likewise, if you have a heart condition in the family, it's more likely that you may develop the heart condition rather than cancer. This is not completely black and white, but for example, if 15 years ago in Chernobyl, the nuclear power plant disaster in Russia. A lot of people were exposed to extremely toxic doses of radiation. Now, not everyone reacted the same way. 600 years ago, 700 years ago, in England, when the bubonic plague, the Black Death, was killing a third of the population, some people were exposed to it and simply did not react at all. And so the constitutional tendency and the physical strength actually becomes a factor. Now, if I'm speaking to you about the different categories of how Chinese medicine views cancer, I'm going to list the 4 major categories to you. But I'm going to do it in reverse order. I'm going to tell you the, the least common and most obscure category first, and then the 4th one I mentioned will be the most important and the most common. The least common category of cancer, according to Chinese medicine, it's a wonderfully, wonderfully obscure word, and I will elaborate on it shortly, is the word phlegm, or catarrh, as you may prefer. The next least common category in Chinese medicine of cancer is a wonderfully, wonderfully descriptive term, fire poison. A fairly common category next, again, I'll be elaborating on each of these in turn, is the category of blood stagnation. And far and away, the most important category is, wait for it, energy, low energy. You can call it qi, you can call it vitality, you can call it life force. It seems very simplistic, but it is incredible. Now, not only is this the most important category of the 4, but it's more important than all of the other categories put together. Not only that, it affects all of the other categories. Not only that, but really in Chinese medicine, it's a factor in all disease. Not only that, it's a factor in all phenomena and all physical reality, and even the world of physics understands the nature of energy. This is what Einstein said. He said, everything is energy, just a different concentration. If it's concentrated enough, it becomes physical. And the Chinese intuitively understood this. You know, this is why when Matthew Manning was speaking, I was hearing it in terms of energy. Some people either physically are strong or they have a gift where they have more energy and the energy comes out of them. And it is something where they can influence objects around them. This is the nature of qi. It is a metaphysical concept, but at the same time, it is very real and very down to earth and very practical and all around us all of the time. Now, in a very, very down to earth practical manner, the 2 biggest problems, the 2 biggest reasons why the energy becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. One is work, the hours of work and or the physical nature of our work. And of course, there is old age. As we get older, we simply have less vitality in our organs. Our organs produce less vitality, and we simply feel it. It's something very simple and very obvious. And the key thing is, in the West, you go to the hospital, you have a problem with cancer, they can take a photograph and look at the nature of the cells. I can sit here and talk to you about Chinese medicine, and I can talk to you about the organs, and you may say, yes, but if you're looking at the cells and cellular pathology, really, it's the cells that make up the organs, so the cells are really more basic than the organs. But to that I say, yes, but it is the qi, it is the energy, which is more basic than the cells. And so it is the qi actually within the cells, which is something that you have to keep your perspective on. Let me give you a practical example. Let's say there's a 25-year-old man and he's starting up a new business. He's working 70-hour week. On the weekend, he's building his own house. And at the same time, he's training for a marathon. Now, if he's 25 years old, he might be able to get away with this schedule for a week or 2 or 3. If he's 30 years old, he would not be able to get away with it at all. But if he's 25 years old, if he carries on for 2 or 3 or 4 months, something happens. Now, in the kitchen, if you have one plug, one socket, and you put 6 different appliances on the one socket, you will burn the fuse. This is what happens in the body. The fuse blows, the fuse burns out. And how would that manifest if for the fuse to burn out? I can explain this problem very simply. For this 25-year-old man who's working a 70-hour week, he's building his own house and he's training for his marathon. It's called the unlimited mind leading the limited body. And people don't know. You know, some of you will remember not that long ago when you're 25 years old. Some of you may have to stretch your memory. But when you're 25 years old, you feel you're immortal. The body is a perfect machine. This is why people in their 60s should speak to people in their 20s to communicate that it is not always going to feel like this. And you know, you have to anticipate, you have to have a sense of what lies in front of you. So it's not a matter of mind over body. This, you know, you can get your unlimited mind, but the body is finite. The body knows its limits. The body is a cruel master. And, you know, if you have an 80-year-old mom or an 80-year-old granny, you don't say to her, okay, today we're going to start our fitness program. First, we're going to do some light calisthenics, and we're going to do some light jogging. You would not begin to do that because the body would not stand it. It's not a matter of her willingness. It is the fact that the body has its limits, and you have to be aware of these limits all the time in terms of energy, in terms of how you feel. And people simply are too often not in touch with this level of reading the body like an animal in the wild. I'm a great believer in sleeping during the day. Now, not everyone can do this. I reckon 15% of people, if they sleep during the day, they feel worse. I can catnap, and it always refreshes me because I explain it very simply. The low point of my day is less low if I have a sleep in the day, and anyone who can tolerate a sleep in the day, I recommend it. Let's look more at the energetic phenomena of what happens with cancer. You have what originally started out as a group of good, healthy cells turning bad. They're turning abnormal. The actual integrity of the cells has gone. Now, each one of us has millions and millions or billions of individual cells. And think of it as a community. Think of it as a team. Think of it as each cell is your best friend and working for you. There's another aspect of this which I find completely fascinating. Now, there's an expression which has been around the last 5 or 10 years, and that expression is emotional intelligence. That person isn't very emotionally intelligent. We've heard this expression, we know what it means. I use a different expression, which I really like, which captures this moment where I am in the lecture, and that is physical intelligence. Each cell, on some level, do not ask me how, has an intelligence. It knows about excretion, it knows about digestion, it knows its function. How does it know? How does it know? On a very primitive level, each cell has its own intelligence. I think that's wonderful. I think that's miraculous. And in terms of energy and what happens with the cell, there are three different aspects. First of all, the group of cells that have become bad are not contributing and adding to the body's overall level of energy. Secondly, that same group of cells is attacking good cells and compromising them, so they also cannot contribute and add to the body's energy. And thirdly, the body's resources are going to that area to try and neutralize it, which is using up additional energy. So in all three different aspects, the body's energy is being used and consumed. This is why energy has so many different implications in terms of cancer and what's happening in the body. Let me give you another example. Let's say you pick up the local Devon newspaper and you read that there is an armed uprising in Exeter. 2,000 people have picked up rifles and clubs and guns, and they are forming in the center of Exeter, and they're protesting. Now, you know, whatever it is, it's going to be something very extreme and very radical, and that's what's happening in the body. Why do normal healthy cells suddenly rebel and go berserk? And the answer is because you're doing a 70-hour week and building a house and training for a marathon. And the body says, we cannot do this. It bursts the fuse. You simply blow a fuse when you do this. I'm going to change this and give you another perspective about the nature of energy. Modern science, modern medicine is wonderful. It can replace your knee. It can replace your hip. You can have a heart transplant. You can have new kidney. Now, if you have this with your car, theoretically, you can replace every single part of your car. Your car theoretically can last for 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. But if you replace every single part of your body, who in this room thinks you can live to be 500 years old? No one. And the answer is because all of us, in our own way, understand the nature of chi, understand the nature of energy. It's the energy which runs out. we can have. See, this is the problem that we have, because today we live in a highly advanced technological age, which has evolved from a mechanical age. We think that we, in our own way, have some overlap with machines and we can do replacement parts. But the unifying and universal and mysterious and non-quantifiable aspect of energy is where the mystery is. And this is the key to Chinese medicine, it's the key to cancer, and it makes the whole debate very, very interesting. Now, the next category, which is not quite as common and not as quite many implications, is the category of blood stagnation. Wonderfully, wonderfully descriptive. Now, the one word I would use in terms of describing the nature of stagnation is streaming. I believe this could be a word that's used in computer jargon. If you have a house with a stream in the garden, the water flows smoothly and evenly through the stream, and it flows all the time. Now, if you happen to have a resident beaver or otter, and he starts building some twigs and branches and other bits of cloth, then things will start catching and getting stuck, and the stream may not flow as smoothly, and things may build up behind that. Now, this has great implications in the body. Let me give you another example. A pearl is formed with a little irritant, and around that irritant, more and more things build up. In the body, you have a little clot, and around that clot, you have more and more things deposited, so the clot then grows and grows and grows. This is the nature of blood stagnation. A clot is a very physical reality of what is blood stagnation. Now, intuitively, there was some understanding of this concept 500 years ago. And some physicians would treat this by bleeding, by letting blood. Unfortunately, 95% of patients would die because either they would let out too much blood, or the patient would be weak, or the patient would be anemic. Occasionally, if there is an embolism or some blockage, then the treatment might work. But this concept is something which was slightly understood, but not really with a proper diagnosis the way that, it could be used in Chinese medicine. And in terms of the nature of stagnation, let me give you another example from the world of geology. New Orleans in America and Alexandria in Egypt are both cities which have very, very fertile soil because they are at the mouth of a great river meeting a sea. Where the river meets the sea, it broadens out and the river slows down, so you have all the sediment from the river which then gets deposited. And this is something which is not too difficult to understand. When the stream slows down, you get the sediment deposited, and it has a formation. And this is what can happen in the body with blood stagnation. So, for example, normally, the normal pulse of the average adult is 72 a minute. But for whatever reason, either from old age or even excessive training, the pulse gets too slow. There is some depositing from the blood. For example, a calcium deposit in the shoulder might be due because the pulse is slower, and this is the phenomena of what happens. And the nature of why you might have an ovarian fibroid turning cancerous again becomes a combination of factors. It may have to do with how long the problem has been. It may have to do with the energy. It may have also to do with the combination of fire poison in the body. And if we're talking about blood stagnation, I also need to talk about qi stagnation, because the blood moves, but also in the body, the qi moves. And qi stagnation in Chinese medicine is associated with breast cancer. And qi stagnation and blood stagnation can both come about through emotional problems. So sometimes emotional problems can make a contribution towards your general health and specifically can feed the pathology which can eventually evolve into something more serious. The category of fire poison, obviously we understand the nature of smoking, so I don't really have to mention anything about smoking, but something which is, this is my view, some of you in the room may understand and agree, some may not. I think one of the areas which affects the blood quality and which causes the blood to be either hot or thick or unclear, many people take medication for a very, very long time, and it's like having a chemical in the blood. Western medicine can be absolutely wonderful, but I think for people who are on medication for 10 or 20 or 30 years, sometimes it can affect the quality of the blood and have long-term health implications. I'm increasingly aware of the time, and I will talk about the category of phlegm, which is the least important, and this is, think of phlegm as dampness. Think of the head of a pint of beer. Someone who drinks a lot of beer, that type of liquid, a frothy liquid in the body, stews and ferments and becomes more and more solid. And it can be a beer belly, but it also can become nodules. And those nodules over a period of time, especially when they become mixed with fire or some type of poison, can also be a type of cancer. Now, the last thing I would like to do is I'd like to tell you a story. Stephen, in his very kind introduction, mentioned Dr. Shen, who was an old Chinese master. And Dr. Shen was born in Shanghai in 1914. And in 1940, when he was already a well-known and established doctor, a friend of a friend came up to him and said, "Oh, Dr. Shen, I have this really good exercise I want to tell you about, but it's so good, I want you to pay me for it." So Dr. Shen, in his wisdom, said, "Okay, let me hear it first, and if I like it, then I will give you money." I told him this story, and Dr. Shen immediately reached into his pocket and handed the man $800, which was a lot of money in China in 1940. And the story of the exercise is this. And Dr. Shen would do this every day for the rest of his life, and it's something I recommend to patients, not just cancer patients, it's patients in good health. It's a wonderful, wonderful exercise. Every morning you wake up, you go to the toilet, you come back to bed, you lie down, you put your hand on your navel. You then press down fairly deeply and you rub clockwise with greater and bigger concentric circles until you're doing the whole cavity, the whole abdominal cavity, deep, hard, not just light, but you're doing it to exercise all the organs, to give the organs circulation, movement, blood supply, etc., etc. So you're lying down, you're exercising your organs, and this is much better than any type of jogging or calisthenics or any exercise that you're doing, because you're not over-tiring the body. You're not putting a strain on the body the way you would with jogging. And so jogging will exercise the muscles and the tendons, but it actually will overtire the organs. This gives movement and activity, rhythmical activity to the organs which they love, while you're lying there in bed. Dr. Shen would do this 20 or 30 minutes every morning. And I have a patient I recommended this exercise to 3 years ago. And in those 3 years, doing this exercise every morning, she's gone from a dress size 35 down to 18. She has physically manhandled all the water and shifted it. She has had fluid coming out of every orifice, and it has been a discharge, and it has been a wonderful, wonderful thing for her to do, and I virtually would recommend it to everyone and anyone. Thank you.